Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Rocket Fist for PC, Mac, and Linux, although there are Xbox One, PlayStation 4, and Wii U versions in development. Full disclaimer before I get into the review proper, I was provided a review copy of this by the developer, so thank you to them for giving me the opportunity to take a look at this thing. This is an arena action game developed by Daniel Sound and published by Amnesia Interactive, and it pretty much flew under the radar. I really haven't seen much coverage of this thing at all. And I'm not entirely sure why, because it seems like something that people would pretty much eat up, and of course they do on the Steam reviews at least. Now, I actually went into this game pretty much blind. I didn't really look at any of the information that was available on it, and I just kind of hopped into the game and let it speak for itself. So the question is, what's it saying? Well, as far as presentation goes, it does scream indie project, and that's because while it is fairly low budget in terms of visuals, they are still very well done because there's a very cohesive vision with it. And what that ultimately means is that while the visuals are certainly nothing amazing, they get the job done and they have a nice bright colorful art style that definitely gets that whole robotic feel down. And it's got a slightly cartoony look to it as well, so for example when things explode you've got some rather cartoony looking particle effects that sort of look nice, but at the same time they're problematic because they actually obscure the action, which is particularly annoying when you're trying to dodge things and you don't see them coming at you through the actual particle effects, which is actually a pretty significant problem at times. There's also the issue of, because of the way this is set up, you can barely tell your character apart from all the other characters, so it's pretty easy to lose track of where you are and end up dying horribly because of it. It helped, for example, to have a marker showing exactly where you are on the screen, because without that it actually can become kind of annoying to try to figure it out sometimes. Particularly if you've decided to change the color of your character from green to really anything else, because then they kind of blend in with the enemies at times. Now of course that's at its most problematic when you're in a cluster, but it is still annoying throughout the game, and it doesn't help that the perspective makes it a bit difficult to keep track of the action as well. Particularly if you're trying to find projectiles and dodge them, but you're not able to figure that out. Now of course they do try to liven the action up a bit by whenever you hit something with a rocket fist, it ends up shaking the screen because of it. You can of course turn that off if you like. But it does help to make the action a bit more frenetic, although it doesn't really need any visual cues to become any more frenetic. But that's something I'll get to in a moment. But before I get to that, I want to mention the sound design by Thiago Adamo, who I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, but anyway. He did the music and the sound design in general, and he did a pretty good job with it. It has some rather nice tracks, mostly techno-inspired stuff that is really more ambient than action-packed. So it may not necessarily fit the action, but at least it's a pretty well done soundtrack. And then there's the sound effects themselves, which again, mostly work pretty well considering that you're dealing with a lot of robotics. But at the same time, I think the explosions could definitely be a lot more beefy. Because as it stands, they almost sound more like a plunk sound, and it's a bit odd. But other than those oddities here and there, it does have generally well done sound design. But of course what really matter here are the story, or rather lack thereof, and the gameplay. Now the lack of story can be attributed to, it gives you a sort of kind of bit of story in the tutorial, which is to say that you are a robot trying to survive against other robots that are apparently infected by some sort of virus. And that's pretty much it. So really it falls to the gameplay to bring things up, and that's where some interesting things happen. See, you can do basically two things when you're actually playing the game. You can either move around and do a dash move, which will send you forward a bit and allow you to stun enemies if you run into them. Or if you have a projectile, you can launch that projectile, and that mostly means you can use the rocket fist. Now, the rocket fist will go out in a straight line. It will also bounce off the walls, and it will do so at various angles, so you end up having to basically move around and throw your rocket fists at things in order to defeat them. While you're doing this, you're trying to make sure that all of your throws are economical, meaning that you at least take out one enemy with a throw, preferably more than one, which is where the angle shots come into play, because you can bounce the rocket fist off of obstacles in order to take out multiple enemies, which is, in theory, a really cool idea. Until you realize you don't really have all that much control over it. You see, it's pretty hard to actually aim the rocket fist because you don't have any sort of targeting reticule or any sort of line denoting exactly what direction the rocket fist is going to go. You just have to wing it based on the general direction in which the fist is pointed on your person. You see, unlike in, say, a twin-stick shooter where one of your analog sticks controls the actual aiming and the other one controls your movement, in this, the analog stick controls your movement and your aiming at the same time, so you can only aim at things by turning your entire body toward them. Now, in theory, that'd be fine, except that you, again, don't get any sort of targeting reticule, and you also don't really get any proper indication of where exactly the fist is going to go, because it's actually throwing off-center. So first you have to adjust to the fact that the fist is going to throw off-center. Next, you have to adjust to the fact that you're going to be moving your entire body around to be able to throw at things. And lastly, you realize that it's mostly just a matter of luck at that point. But then you pretty much give up on the concept of precision in the game and just start throwing at random, hoping that your careening, nonsensical shot will bounce off the wall at just the right angle to hit the enemy that's trying to kill you, or it will bounce off the wall and hit another rocket fist and send that careening into an enemy in order to take them out. And most of the time, it just ends up being a complete crapshoot. You just try and fail miserably to hit things, and it'll send your rocket fists flying all over the place ineffectually. Which is, of course, immensely frustrating. And by immensely frustrating, I mean this game actually legitimately made me angry. I have absolutely no problem whatsoever when my performance in a game is dictated by my actual lack of skill. But in this particular case, it's not a matter of skill, it's a matter of the controls in themselves are objectively imprecise, and you're constantly having to fight that in order to be able to do anything. This is especially true when it introduces the concept of catching rocket fists that get thrown at you, instead of just dodging out of the way of them or just getting smacked in the face by them. You see, if you're facing them and you time the button press at just the right time, you'll catch it instead of actually getting smacked in the face. At least I think that's how that works, because it just kinda threw that in there and I kept doing it by accident, not exactly knowing what I was doing and how I was suddenly catching things. You see, the vast majority of my time wasn't really worrying about trying to get a nice precise shot off or trying to time my button press properly for catching an incoming rocket fist. No, it was just hoping that any of my throws would actually connect with something, and it was also hoping that I just didn't get hit in the face with something. Obviously, your mileage may vary on that, but I don't find that remotely fun. Again, all it did was make me angry. A chaotic mess of enemies throwing rocket fists and cannons shooting things at you and such like that is just not fun. It's chaotic and annoying. And the further into the single player you get, the more frenetic it gets because it's throwing new enemy types at you. Eventually you'll get enemy types that will actually just split into multiple copies of those that happen to be smaller. You'll end up with enemies that will explode when you hit them. You'll end up with enemies that will move around rather quickly, in fact quicker than you can, and throw rocket fists at a surprisingly high level of precision. And once you hit the end of each zone, you're going to run into a boss fight. The first 3 of which are actually ridiculously easy. And then you hit the 4th one, and that's a guy who can basically insta-gib you without much trouble. So unless you get lucky and score a lot of hits really quickly, that ends up being complete disaster. Now here's the problem with that. That's the second to last boss of the game. The last boss is at the end of Zone 5. And if you're wondering, each zone will take you maybe 5 to 10 minutes to complete depending on how quick you are at eliminating all the enemies. Needless to say, your single player options are rather limited and the AI can get rather frustrating, particularly when it starts to gang up on you and get you stuck in things before all of a sudden smacking you in the face with a rocket fist. This means that inevitably you'll try to go over to the multiplayer and get that going on, which I guess could be fun if you played it more like a party game. You just get a bunch of friends together and just start goofing off and watching the madness get more maddening. But here's the problem. You're gonna have to all huddle around the same computer, because in its current state, it only has beta online multiplayer, and I couldn't get into a single game. Because apparently in this case, beta means it's completely non-functional. So what does that leave you with? Well, it leaves you with up to 4-player local versus, and that's it. And that's a pretty significant problem, because a lack of online multiplayer is mostly kinda sorta okay for a console game, but it's not remotely okay for a PC game. You see, most people who play PC games don't really play them on a couch with plenty of controllers laying around for people to be able to hook them up to the computer and thus get a console experience, which means that online multiplayer is pretty much a necessity for PC. And with that not working, it means that the actual value proposition of this game, if you somehow manage to get something out of this chaotic gameplay style, is extremely limited. I have absolutely no qualms admitting that this is the kind of game I would literally only play at a party. The kind of game that I would just get a bunch of friends together with and just goof off at a party, because that's when that sort of thing is kind of amusing. For just general gameplay, it's not. And in this particular case, it becomes more irritating than anything else. That tends to happen when the game is constantly extending its middle finger to you in some fashion, unless you're just goofing off entirely. And the fact that you maybe have about 50 minutes to an hour of single-player gameplay followed by however long you spend in the multiplayer, if it even works at all, means that the value proposition of this game is actually rather low. Because, let's face it, unless you like the core concept, you're not going to get much out of this thing. Now here's my dilemma with this. It's not simply a matter of I don't like it, it's a matter of it has some pretty significant problems that need to be addressed. 1. The inherent lack of precision. It needs to be fixed, or it needs to at least be ameliorated by giving you some depiction of where exactly your shot is going to go. Otherwise, you're pretty much just guessing as to where that shot is going to go careening off to next, and you don't really have any good description of exactly how it's going to react with the world around it. It could go bouncing off a wall in 2 different ways in a somewhat similar impact, and you don't really know why. Either way, you end up having the same result. You don't feel like you're actually getting decent at the game, or you don't feel like you have any sort of actual control over where your shots are going. You only have this vague idea of, hey, it's gonna go in this general direction, and it might kinda sorta hit these things, if I'm lucky. And that's just not fun. Next up, there needs to be a better indicator of where exactly the player character is, otherwise it's easy to get lost in the confusion. Next up, you need to fix the particle effects, because they continually obscure the action and make it rather difficult to actually dodge things, and through really no fault of the players. But really, the most important thing about the game is to fix the online multiplayer, because if you don't fix that, then good luck actually getting much of a player base for this thing. Again, local multiplayer is fine on a console, but even on console, online is becoming the norm, and for very good reason. For PC, it's pretty much mandatory. You don't just make local multiplayer only games on PC and expect them to do well, because they just won't. And all of that means that the value proposition, even if you do like the concept, and even if you do somehow manage to like the chaos that goes on screen, is actually rather low, which means that the asking price of $15 is, oddly enough, kinda steep in its current state. I mean, this thing may not necessarily be the same genre, but it's competing with the likes of Duck Game, which is something that is about $13, has online multiplayer, and has a hell of a lot of content. That's some pretty stiff competition when you get down to it, and frankly, there's just way better options out there than Rocket Fist, certainly in its current state. And a lot of that comes from the fact that it's a primarily multiplayer game that you can't really play multiplayer on unless you get a bunch of people crowded around a single computer. Which, well, good luck with that. Ultimately, I give this thing a 2 out of 5. If they improve things later on down the line, then maybe I'll update the video, but until then, thanks for watching.